In today's world, where public opinion still often defines a woman's worth through the lens of her relationships, the question arises, what does it really mean for a woman to live alone? It's not a challenge to society, but rather a deep dive into oneself, a conscious choice that challenges established norms. Why are more and more women choosing solitude? Perhaps this path doesn't lead to a rejection of love, but to a return to something more important and sacred. Nowadays, there is a trend where women increasingly choose to live alone, viewing it not as a temporary phenomenon but as a conscious step towards self-discovery. Society may label them as lonely, rebellious, or even incomplete. However, if we turn to the works of Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, we can see something more in this phenomenon: female solitude as a catalyst for deep transformation. At the heart of this choice lies a complex process: confrontation with the inner masculine, Animus, integration of the shadow, and, as a result, a striving for individuation, becoming a whole person, regardless of the presence of a partner. It's not just about physical solitude, but about a deep truth that many women experience in the silence of their hearts. Solitude can be the key to their liberation. For centuries, a woman's identity has been closely intertwined with her social roles: wife, mother, homemaker. Her value was measured by her ability to nurture, obey, and uphold family values. Independence was not only discouraged, but often seen as a threat. A single woman aroused either pity or suspicion, and her solitude was seen as a failure, not as a conscious choice. However, today the situation is changing dramatically. More and more women are abandoning traditional paths, not out of disappointment, but because they are discovering an important truth. Self-realization does not necessarily have to be conditioned by the presence of another person in their life. What awaits them ahead? What discoveries and changes will occur in their lives if they decide to go down this path? The changes taking place in society make us think about the reasons that brought them to life. Economic independence, access to education, and the gradual weakening of traditional patriarchal foundations have opened up horizons for women that their predecessors could not have dreamed of. However, in addition to the obvious factors, a complex psychological process is taking place in the depths of the soul. According to Carl Jung's theory, the desire for independence has not only social roots, but also an archetypal nature. A woman who chooses to live alone does not reject men as such, but rather challenges her animus, the hidden masculine energy that lives in her subconscious. Jung argued that every woman possesses an inner masculine principle, the animus, which influences her intelligence, self-confidence, and perception of power. In a situation where a woman is completely dependent on a man for material well-being or recognition, her animus remains dormant or even suppressed. However, when she is left alone with herself, this inner strength awakens. She has to exhibit qualities that she previously sought in a partner: decisiveness, independence, and self-confidence. The key difference is that it is not about the need for a man as such, but about the harmonious integration of the masculine principle within oneself. The integration of female independence into the public consciousness is often fraught with difficulties. Society still holds prejudices, arguing that a woman living alone is allegedly incomplete, and her independence is perceived only as a temporary phenomenon, not as a conscious choice. However, Jungian psychology offers a different perspective. A woman who deeply understands her animus and does not project it onto a partner acquires a more complete self. She does not seek to fill an inner void in a man, but interacts with the masculine principle both within herself and in the external world, based on a state of inner harmony. In this context, the question shifts from why is she alone to who is she becoming? At the center of the Jungian approach lies the idea of individuation, a continuous process of self-knowledge and becoming a person free from social stereotypes and unconscious patterns of behavior. For a woman who has chosen solitude, being alone becomes a kind of laboratory for personal transformation. In the absence of constant influence from others reflecting her identity, she faces a fundamental question: who am I when no one is watching? In silence and solitude, external stimuli disappear, opening the way to deep self-knowledge. However, the road to self-knowledge and independence is fraught with many risks. As Jung astutely noted, solitude is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it can open the gates to a deep understanding of oneself, and on the other, it can turn into an escape from the necessary interaction with other people. The decisive factor here is a conscious choice. If a woman retreats into isolation, driven by fear or unresolved emotional wounds, it can hinder her personal growth, only strengthening defense mechanisms instead of dissolving them. But when solitude becomes the result of a conscious decision, it turns into a crucible where strength and self-confidence are tempered. She learns to trust her inner voice, assert her uniqueness, and build a relationship with herself that no external connection can replace. It is at this stage that working with the shadow becomes inevitable. The shadow, according to Jung's definition, is that part of our psyche that we reject, suppress, or hide from prying eyes, often because it contradicts our self-image or social norms. For a woman who has chosen solitude, the shadow can manifest itself in the most unexpected way. The fear of loneliness can strike not as a quiet companion, but as an all-consuming horror. Public opinion, throwing up barbed phrases like, "You'll end up living surrounded by cats," "You're too picky," or "You're selfish," can echo in her mind, exposing a deeply rooted sense of shame. Even her independence can turn into its shadow side if she over-identifies with it, turning it into armor that protects against vulnerability and intimacy. Nevertheless, it is in the struggle with these inner shadows that the potential for significant personal growth lies. By recognizing her fear of loneliness, but not allowing it to influence her decisions, a person restores lost inner strength. By ceasing to perceive the stereotypes imposed by society, she gets the opportunity to independently determine her value. By finding a balance between independence and openness to the world, it is possible to avoid the danger of spiritual escapism, using solitude not to escape from essential human needs, but to accept them meaningfully. This is the paradoxical essence of Jung's teaching. Achieving true wholeness is possible not through denying any aspects of one's own personality, but through recognizing and accepting the darkest corners of one's psyche. Thus, loneliness becomes not just a lifestyle, but a kind of path of initiation, a road to self-knowledge. A woman who has chosen this path does not become ideal or self-sufficient in the conventional sense. She gains something much more, authenticity. She no longer tries to run away from her shadows or allow them to control her actions. She learns to find harmony between solitude and communication, independence and vulnerability, until she realizes a simple but profound truth. She is already a whole person. A common but erroneous opinion about women who prefer solitude is that they are supposedly doomed to longing and isolation. However, it is important to understand that solitude and loneliness are completely different concepts. Loneliness grows out of a sense of detachment from the world, while solitude is a conscious choice, an opportunity to delve into oneself and establish a connection with one's inner world. As Carl Jung argued, a woman who chooses solitude does not simply suffer from a lack of connections, but actively rethinks them. She may experience moments of loneliness, but at the same time, she discovers an amazing ability to feel comfortable and confident alone with herself. A valuable skill that is often overlooked by those who desperately cling to relationships for fear of being alone. Another common misconception is that a woman living alone supposedly rejects her femininity, as if the essence of female existence lies solely in her attachment to other people. However, Jungian psychology completely refutes this idea. True femininity, according to Jung, is not external manifestations or social roles, but rather an inner strength, a way of being that includes such qualities as receptivity, intuition, creativity, and inner resilience. A woman who chooses solitude does not deny her femininity, but on the contrary, often deepens it, freeing herself from the stereotypes and expectations that once limited her self-expression. Despite society's awareness of the benefits of independence, women who have chosen solitude still face serious challenges. Social pressure manifests itself in the form of hidden judgments and undisguised pity, which has a significant impact on their self-esteem. Relatives, driven by good intentions, often ask the question, "When are you planning to start a family?" implying that a woman's full life begins only with marriage. The deeply ingrained cultural stereotype of the unhappy, lonely woman portrays her as a tragic figure, deprived of the ability to determine her own destiny. Unfortunately, some women internalize these stereotypes, beginning to doubt their independence and perceiving it as a flaw rather than a strength. In this context, it becomes especially important to distinguish between healthy solitude and isolation. Healthy solitude is a conscious choice, an active state in which a woman interacts with herself and the world around her on her own terms. Isolation, on the other hand, is often a way to avoid life's difficulties and protect oneself from unresolved emotional wounds. As Jung argued, psychological growth does not consist in avoiding social connections, but in building relationships based on the integrity of the individual. A woman seeking isolation may subconsciously avoid confronting her internal conflicts, while a woman choosing solitude consciously faces them. A woman who has chosen the path of solitude faces a complex task, not only to meet societal expectations, but also to clearly distinguish between solitude that offers new opportunities and escapism. In this constant search for balance, she needs to ask herself a key question. Am I driven by a desire to escape problems or a desire for self-discovery? The answer determines whether solitude becomes a voluntary confinement or a gateway to a deep understanding of oneself, unwavering confidence in one's own authenticity, and ultimately a life lived on one's own terms. Jung's research on archetypes of femininity reveals an important truth. Solitude has always been a kind of initiation rite, leading to wisdom. The archetype of the Great Mother is traditionally associated with care and fertility, but its shadow side contains a deeper lesson, the ability to be self-sufficient. A woman living alone does not reject this archetype, but transforms it, becoming both mother and child in her own story. Similarly, the archetype of the wise woman manifests not through relationships with others, but through the alchemical process of transforming solitude into deep self-knowledge. This is the deep paradox. By rejecting established stereotypes that define the female role, a woman often comprehends its true essence. Myths and psychological theories agree on one thing: self-sufficiency has always been a path of spiritual development. Ancient civilizations had a special reverence for independent femininity, starting with the image of the virgin goddess Artemis, wandering in the wild, and ending with the prophetesses of the Delphic oracle, whose wisdom was born in voluntary solitude. These archetypes remind us that a state that society often stigmatizes as loneliness has historically been perceived as a sacred space, as a fertile void in which profound changes occur. Carl Jung considered this process an integral part of individuation, when the rejection of externally imposed definitions allows the true self to manifest. The modern woman who has embarked on this path becomes a participant in the ancient tradition of the rebirth of female power. History provides many striking examples of women who have managed to turn solitude into a source of strength. Take, for example, Artemis, the ancient Greek goddess who rejected marriage to wander the wild lands. Her independence was not a deprivation, but an expression of devotion to her true nature. Or consider Virginia Woolf, whose famous work, A Room of One's Own, formulated what Jung would call the psychological need for space to unleash creative female energy. These women did not simply exist in solitude, they used it as a crucible for the development of genius and self-realization. Even mythical characters, such as Baba Yaga, the fearsome but wise old woman from Slavic folklore, demonstrate how society both fears and needs a woman who occupies a separate position. Epical traditions continue in the experience of contemporaries. Today's women tell of significant discoveries that occurred to them during solo journeys. An artist who regained her voice after a long period of silence. An executive who learned to trust her own intuition, abandoning constant meetings. A healer who discovered her talents in a state of tranquility. Their stories echo Jung's belief that some truths are learned only in solitude. One of the women describes the years spent alone as a time when she stopped playing the role of a woman and began to live it. Another shares, "In the silence I discovered parts of myself that I didn't even know existed." These testimonies confirm a universal truth. A woman who dares to be alone with herself often realizes that she has never been alone, but has been in deep connection with her true self. In conclusion of this stage of the journey, a radical rethinking is proposed. What if living alone is not a deficiency, but a deep connection with the inner feminine divine? A woman who chooses this path follows in the footsteps of priestesses, mystics, and creators who have left their mark on history. Her solitude transforms from an empty space into a sacred place where she can finally hear the whisper of her deepest wisdom. From a Jungian perspective, she achieves what many strive for, but only a few attain, not just independence, but true individuation, a return to her wholeness. Through the lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, a woman's decision to choose a solitary path appears not merely as a choice of a certain lifestyle, but as a rich psychological and spiritual journey. Her solitary existence becomes like a mirror reflecting the unmanifest aspects of her personality, in particular, the masculine principle in the female psyche, Animus, requiring integration, the shadow sides that must be confronted, and the social stereotypes that must be broken down in order to achieve integrity. It is important to emphasize that this path does not imply a rejection of interpersonal connections, but rather aims to establish a deeper and more sincere connection with oneself. By acting in this way, a woman joins the ancient archetype of feminine wisdom, taking her place in the ranks of outstanding women and mythological characters who have managed to transform solitude into a symbol of independence and self-sufficiency. The truth underlying this process is simple, yet radical. Living alone is not an act of rejecting men, but represents an acceptance of oneself in all fullness and diversity. It is a statement that a woman's self-sufficiency and integrity do not depend on the presence of a partner, but are the result of her willingness to explore and accept all aspects of her personality, including masculine and feminine traits, light and dark sides, strength and vulnerability. Encountering her inner world face to face, a woman discovers something truly amazing: the love, recognition, and sense of belonging that she once unsuccessfully sought in the external world have always been within her reach, hidden in the depths of her own